Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a virtual presentation of the Lawrence Family JCC, Jacobs Family Campus. Tonight's event is a presentation of the San Diego International Jewish Film Festival and the Arts and Ideas departments at the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture. My name is Ryan Isaac. I am the Director of Cultural Arts at the San Diego CJC. Again, welcome. I hope that everybody is in good spirits and doing well as we wrap up week 6 of our sheltering at home and flattening the curve. And as long as we are at home flattening, the JCC and CJC will continue to build this virtual community through Jewish cultural events and entertainment like tonight's. I do want to thank our underwriters, the underwriters of the 2019-2020 Arts and Ideas season and of the film festival. Due to the generosity of the underwriters, we are able to have events like this and continue to come together. Thank you very much. And as we're all starting to get used to Zoom, just keep in mind, it's nice to see a lot of faces. Remember, we can all see you too. So smile. We have a bunch of events coming up in the near future. One I do want to share with you. The next event will be Sunday at 6:30 p.m. with Emily Pastor. Emily is a food blogger and a cookbook author and chef. Her website, West of the Loop, gets a lot of traffic, including by my wife for the challah she bakes. So it's going to be exciting to have Emily with us this Sunday, and she is going to be doing a hands-on live lesson of making sauerkraut. So we're going to ferment together. I'm going to have my head of green cabbage, my knives sharpened. Hopefully by the end of Sunday, I'll still have all 10 of these. And feel free to play along at home. There'll be an email going out tomorrow with the details. And I think we can share a link for everybody later tonight as well. In the meantime, though, before going off any further in that, I do want to welcome tonight's guest, Beth Accomando. Beth is a longtime friend of the JCC. She was part of the film festival way back in the day, doing some of the dirty work to make it happen. 30 years later, we're still standing and doing well. Good to see you, Sandra, one of our film session committee members here tonight, Sandra Silverstein. Beth is an arts and culture reporter for KPBS. She is also NPR's cinema contributor, and she is the host of the Cinema Junkie podcast. You can find her on Twitter at Cinebeth, which is spelled like cinema, not like Cinnabon. And we can figure out where else to keep tabs of Beth later on. But without further ado, Beth, welcome. How are you? How are you holding up, and how are you staying busy?
Oh, I'm doing well. I'm sheltering at home with a roommate and my son and 2 dogs. So dogs make everything, much easier to deal with. I have dog therapy every day. And you may hear them. I can't guarantee they'll be silent. Hopefully they'll be well behaved.
So we've been talking in preparation of tonight for some of the ideas, some ways that film buffs can kind of relate to how things used to be through film, given the pandemic we're in now. And you've discussed the Depression and how people enjoyed film or used it as a diversion in the 30s. Do you want to dive right into what we've been talking about?
Sure. So for my podcast, I was doing the first podcast I did after we sheltered at home was about the pandemic. And I talked to an epidemiologist about the film Contagion and how good that was at predicting what we're going through. But then I realized that maybe we don't all want to intensify the stress and anxiety that we're already suffering. So I turned to a friend of mine that I had met through the TCM Film Festival, Nora Fiore, who is the Nitrate Diva on Twitter. And we both have a common love for screwball comedies. And screwball comedies came about in the early 1930s. And this was during the Great Depression. And, they were part of the response that Hollywood had in terms of creating some entertainment that was diverting for people. And even though money was tight, a lot of people allowed themselves to enjoy films now and again. And, the movie business did tremendously well during the Depression. And, I was thinking about the fact that during the Depression, people had a lot of stress and anxiety. There was high unemployment, but people could physically go out to a movie, have this communal feeling of being in a theater with a bunch of other people, and especially at a comedy, that kind of nourishing group laughter that you get can really make you feel good. And, I was thinking, with what we have now, sheltering at home, we can't have that communal part of it, but I still think that screwball comedies are a wonderful diversion because they are fast, they are funny, they're some of the best scripted films you'll ever find. The women are on equal footing with the men. And the other thing about them is as funny and wild and zany and wacky as they are, they're not mindless films. They really do have something to say about the human condition. And so while you're, enjoying all this comedy, you also don't have to feel like you've completely, put your brain on hold. There's some nice meat on the bones too.
And those films, the screwballs of the screwball comedies of the 30s, were they, obviously they were written and produced before the Depression, but what was the general atmosphere like leading into that for cinema that gave birth to those films?
Sure. So the screwball comedies came on the tail end of what's called the PreCode Hollywood. So when the Depression hit, Hollywood for the first time was seeing revenue go down, and they had a bit of a panic. And this was a time when the government and the Catholic Church especially were trying to censor films and keep them a little more clean, a little more morally, upright. And there was a push to do that, and there was a code that the industry created which had all these rules and regulations about what you could do, what you couldn't do. People have probably seen the poster that came from Life magazine that said, here are the 10 commandments of the things you can't do. You can't show an exposed bosom, you can't show the inside of a thigh, you can't show law and order defeated, you can't point a gun at a policeman, things like that. But when they saw their revenues go down, Hollywood decided, well, what will get people into the theater? And sex would get people into the theater, sensationalism, gangster pictures. So they kind of put the code on hold and made films that were a little risque. And this is when they kind of discovered these kind of sexy comedies in the early 30s, like between 1930 and 34. The birth of the screwball comedy is frequently looked at as 1934 with It Happened One Night. But those films, those kind of zany, romantic comedies, were definitely dovetailing off of these pre-code Hollywood films where they were a little risque and, having battles of the sexes, and romantic comedies where there might be a little infidelity or adultery. And in these films, like in It Happened One Night, if anybody's familiar with it, there's the famous scene where Claudette Colbert and Clark Gable are forced to share a hotel room together, which was quite scandalous. They weren't married, they were total strangers. And Clark Gable decides he's going to put up a string with a blanket and call it the Walls of Jericho, and nothing can tear those walls down, and she'll be perfectly safe on her side. And at one point, to try and get her on her side of the room, she doesn't want to go because she's being kind of pouty. She's a rich girl, an heiress who's fled from her father and is trying to make it on her own across the country. And Clark Gable says, well, if you stay on this side, I'm going to get undressed. And here's how a man undresses. And he starts to take off his clothes. And his line when he gets to the pants is, well, now it's every man for himself. And of course, she goes running over. But, it was this kind of hinting at sexuality in a very clever and funny way. And, people loved that. And that drew people to the theater. And these kind of comedies with that kind of a little bit of a sexy, there were always a lot of these like lingerie scenes or people undressing in bedrooms, or backstage musicals where you would catch the showgirls, in the changing room. And those were things that Hollywood felt would draw an audience in. So these films were very much coming off of that pre-code era. And it was definitely one strand of genre filmmaking that Hollywood was focusing on that it felt would draw audiences in. And, you know, this is a time when women ruled the box office, and these actresses, Claudette Colbert, Carole Lombard, Rosalind Russell, Jean Arthur, Barbara Stanwyck, I mean, these were just fabulously talented actresses. You also had Mae West, who was not only a talented actress, but she wrote, produced her own films. There's the dog.
Big Mae West fan.
So these films were, you know, very popular at the time, and Hollywood was able to see you know, an increase in the box office at this time. We're going to try and take care of him.
So then, coming out of the Depression and the kind of films that were made during that time, do you think that would can shed any light on what we should expect to see in a year or two? And, like, you know, and how does Hollywood rebound from this?
Well, the main difference between Depression era and now is the fact that Hollywood has not only has had the theaters physically shut down so they can't release films, but they've also had to shut down all production. So you know, that curve to ramp back up production and what things people are going to think they want to jump into in terms of themes and stories is still a little up in the air. But, you know, one thing that I've been noticing is there's a lot of creativity out there. And, you know, there are people, right now I've been focusing a lot on local San Diego theater. And there's a lot of people writing 10-minute plays that you can perform at home. There's, you know, the 48-hour film project is encouraging people to make movies in their house where, you know, actors read their parts in their own homes, but then they intercut the scenes. So, you know, there's a lot of innovation going on and ways of dealing with our sheltering in home. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out in the way filmmakers decide to make films. Are we going to have Zoom movies coming out that will use this technology if we end up sheltering in home too long? But I'm really interested to see what's going to happen. But I think this is going to be a much bigger challenge for Hollywood to come back from than the Depression, because in actuality, during the Depression, Hollywood did quite well. They were able to make films. They were able to produce films on a, you know, a steady and a steady flow. This is a time when the studios were strong, so these were assembly lines for making films. So they had on staff all the time, you know, actors, writers, directors, production designers, costume designers. So it was great for them to be able to produce these films.
And it was really the only option back then, as opposed to now with what technology allows. The amount of films that are not being released straight through streaming, do you think that is going to impact the future of filmmaking and film consumption?
Yeah, I mean, you know, every time there's new technology, people say that the film industry or, you know, movie theaters going to the cinema is going to die. TV came and they said, well, people aren't going to go to the movies anymore. Then VHS came out, then DVD, then streaming. And so far, cinemas actually physically going to a theater has managed to survive each time. Whether or not it can weather this and come back in full strength, I'm hoping, and I think it will, but we may not have as many theaters, or they may be slightly different. Maybe this is what's going to allow small single screen theaters to thrive more, because it's, you know, it's a single, like, mom and pop kind of setup, and maybe they will be able to survive, whereas AMC or these big chains, which had a lot of money invested, may not. It may also be a return to something like we had in the 30s, where studios own their own cinemas. This may be a point in time where Netflix says, maybe we buy AMC and we show Netflix movies primarily in there, and maybe give some space to something else. So I'm sure cinemas will come back, and I'm not sure if they will be exactly like we had them before, and that transition time between when we start heading back to the movies, are we going to have 50% attendance? Is it going to be, people sitting every other seat, things like that? Nobody knows.
Well, let's get back to the fun and to the diversions, the screwball comedies. What are you watching now? What are you recommending now? How can we all just unplug for an evening and laugh?
Well, two of my favorite, well, there's so many, but one of my favorite directors is Preston Sturges. And his mother was one of Isadora Duncan's kind of fan club tag-along people. So he grew up in this kind of very crazy environment, but it also gave him a lot of sardonic wit and a little bit of disdain for the upper class and for both the upper class and for art. And so his films are incredibly witty, irreverent. His films are like The Lady Eve, where you have Barbara Stanwyck as this card shark who, seduces and beguiles Henry Fonda. There's Palm Beach Story with Claudette Colbert. There's a hilarious one called Miracle of Morgan's Creek, where this young woman seems to have had sex with multiple soldiers and is, her reputation is ruined. However, she ends up having quintets, or I think that's, or however many, no, 6 kids, I think, because there were supposedly 6 soldiers, and she has 6 kids. So instead of her being this kind of, fallen woman, the town is so excited that they have, this miracle that she ends up being celebrated as a heroine, and she ends up marrying kind of the little dorky guy that loves her, but wasn't able to win her over. So I mean, it's this play on morality, where it's like they get to thumb their nose at the status quo and at the stuffy folks that are there. So Preston Sturges is someone I highly recommend. You can search for these films. I'll try to give you guys a list, because I believe Ryan said that he could share some links and things like that. Some of these films are public domain, so you can actually look for them on YouTube or on the Internet Archive and be able to watch, I believe, The Stand-In and True Confession and My Man Godfrey are all available free. And My Man Godfrey has Carol Lombard, who is one of the most wonderful comedians ever. She was absolutely delightful. As I mentioned, Frank Capra did It Happened One Night, but also Meet John Doe and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And then, of course, perhaps the fastest talking screwball comedies come from Howard Hawks. So you've got films like Ball of Fire, His Girl Friday, 20th Century, Bringing Up Baby. And I think that's one of the real trademarks of these films is the dialogue is sometimes so rapid fire and back and forth, and the women are just as witty and fun as the men in these films. The battle of the sexes tends to be a little more equal than you sometimes see in some later comedies in maybe the late 40s and 50s. But I do remember there's a scene in His Girl Friday where Cary Grant is talking incredibly fast and Rosalind Russell's listening, and she starts talking like an auctioneer, and she's like, and sold, as soon as he finishes his sentence. And that's kind of like the pace that you feel is in these screwball comedies. But the other thing about them is they do have an eye for what's going on in the Depression as well, especially the Frank Capra films. In It Happened One Night, it's a dizzy heiress and there's hilarious things going on, but when they're riding on the bus together, there's a point at which this woman faints, and she faints because she doesn't have enough money to buy food. So a lot of these films have a sense of what that reality is. My Man Godfrey starts where it's a bunch of rich people on a scavenger hunt, and one of the things they have to find is a forgotten man. And in Depression era terms, this would have been somebody who fought in World War I, but is now unemployed, is a bum or a hobo. And so, it starts with this sense of there's all these people living in poverty and there's all these rich people, and yet they still find humor in the interaction between those. So that's one of the things I really love about these films, is that they do have a sense of the real world as well as giving us this bright, bubbly champagne comedy.
So it's a nice combo, and
Yes.
certainly something I've heard and read that you've touched on, that just because it's bubbly doesn't mean it's devoid of any kind of intelligence. So,
At least not these.
right. What filmmakers were influenced by these? Where can we kind of see these fingerprints in more contemporary films?
I mean, I think in almost any romantic comedy you see, there's this sense of those battles of the sexes that you had with Carole Lombard and Frederick March and Nothing Sacred, or, you know, Tracy and Hepburn a little later on, Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. I mean, I think that sense of the interplay between them and the pace you can see in a lot of the best contemporary comedies. And I think you saw a lot of this too in television sitcoms also. I think some of the style and comedy spilled over into that, but I'm not sure anybody has been able to completely recreate what happened then. And I think part of it was the studio system, which allowed for very strong actresses, which we don't have quite so much now. I mean, you know, someone like Mae West, it's hard to find an actress today who acts, writes, produces, you know, their own material. She had a lot of control over her career and over the things that she did. But I think, you know, you'll hear a lot of people reference, a lot of directors will talk about people like Sturges and Frank Capra and Howard Hawks and, you know, people like that. And I don't think you will see readily recognizable things necessarily, because I think, you know, it's not like with Hitchcock where you might see thrillers and films paying tribute in very kind of specific, you know, references to a way a scene was shot or to a particular style. Because these films weren't, you know, they weren't like film noir where you could imitate like the visual style of it and in quite so recognizable a way. But I think in the smart script writing, I think a lot of contemporary comedy writers will reference like Sturges as a writer that they felt, you know, if you want to learn how to write a sharp script, take a look at him.
What would happen? I just listened to you describe all this and just started wondering, what if one of these was remade today? Who stars in this, and does it get any traction, or is it a flop? What happens?
I don't know. You know, I'm sure there have been. I'm trying to think if there's actually been specifically like one of these titles remade. I mean, they. Adam Sandler tried to redo Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and that was a total fiasco. But yeah, I don't know if any have been specifically remade. I mean, I think there's definitely when they try to, again, when it comes to these romantic comedies where they try to do the battle of the sexes, whether it's War of the Roses or Romancing the Stone or, you know, some of these Goldie Hawn comedies. I mean, I think there's this sense that they want to capture that spirit of these films. I mean, honestly, the screwball comedies of the 30s are what probably set all my false expectations for what marriage should be like. Like, I thought it was supposed to be William Powell and Myrna Loy having this witty repartee and, you know, I was sadly disappointed. It wasn't quite like that. But I'm not sure that modern films know how to capture it quite as well. I mean, we had a whole period, I think, like the 50s and 60s, where a lot of the romantic comedies were trying very hard, like with the Doris Day comedies, to give us a female character who was, you know, trying to be modern and contemporary. But it was so forward in the messaging that it lost a lot of the lightness and wit that I think you find in the 30s films, where there wasn't as much of an effort to make a message out of it, but you had that feeling when you see Barbara Stanwyck in Ball of Fire or Lady Eve, she is such a strong character and she has so much agency in these films, and she is the one driving those plots. And that's the thing that was really important in those films. And I think sometimes in more recent films or in later comedies, there is such an effort to try and make the male and female characters equal that you tend to see more of kind of like the devices at work, and you tend to see how they're manipulating things as opposed to just letting it flow naturally from a really good script and a really strong cast.
It's interesting. And that's just, I mean, is that the era or just the way that just a quality of writing?
I mean, I think it's a number of things, but I do think, the studio system had its flaws. A lot of actors complained that they were typecast and they weren't allowed to take on the roles they wanted, or, they were sometimes forced to make films they didn't like at all. But what it did do is it did have this, some very talented people that were on call all the time. So you could have the best costume designers, composers, set designers, directors, writers. And again, it did work in favor of some of these stars who had the ability to make really good films and were, the studios supported, if audiences were coming to see Carole Lombard and audiences were coming to see Barbara Stanwyck, those actresses ended up having a lot of power because they were popular. And I don't think we've seen, quite the same equality in that kind of casting today, even though, we have a lot of awareness about we need to get more women behind the camera, we need to get more women screenwriters, but we're still struggling with balancing out some of those things. So, I mean, I think it was a magical moment for whatever reason. I'm not sure we can recapture that, but, we do have a lot of great films that are being made. They're just not in exactly the same vein. It's like film noir. We still have film noir made today, and there's still a lot of great ones, but nothing quite captures that lightning in the bottle of those film noirs that were made in the 1940s, because there was a particular mix of talent and, themes and things that were going on that just blended perfectly.
We had filmmaker James Friedman with us a couple weeks ago. It might have been yesterday. It could have been 2 months ago. And he wrote the documentary about Carl Laemmle, and was peeling back some of the layers of that, the research and what he learned. And at Universal, Laemmle employed an incredible amount of female executives and producers. And just to hear his story, to hear what you're talking about now, to think about just doing that without looking for some sort of societal pat on the back or acceptance. There was no social media. There were no hashtags back then. It just happened and it was successful. I think for me, it's a part of American history through cinema that I wasn't aware of. And it's incredible to see how strong it once was, and then how backwards we went, really. More an observation than a question there. I do want to throw it out there for anybody else, everybody with us. If you have any questions for Beth, you can use the chat function and let us know. Or for those of you who we can see, if you just want to raise your hand, it's a nice and intimate enough crowd for us tonight to unmute you and let you talk if you want to interact a bit. While you're all thinking, another question for you, Beth, in terms of the Screwballs and not even evolving, but jumping forward to where we are today, when the studios and the life resumes, do you think from an insider perspective, does it just pick up as to where it was 2 months ago, or do the projects that are half produced right now stop because the climate's different?
Well, it depends how long it is before theaters open. Places like Georgia are talking about opening cinemas on April 27th. China thought they were going to open their cinemas back in March, but ended up immediately closing them again. So I think it depends. If it ends up where cinemas open back up in the fall, and a lot of the big films that were supposed to be released in May or over the summer get to open in the fall, I don't think you're going to see a huge change in how things, are done. But if this ends up where cinemas are closed through next spring or something like that, then I think there's going to be a major transitional period, because there's going to be a chunk of time where films could not be made, and how many of those get picked up where they left off, and how many of them end up just being completely tossed aside because the timing is no longer working, or the particular, conglomeration of talent is no longer available to all work together. That remains to be seen.
Interesting. So when I know you write regularly, and is the podcast once a month or
Twice a month?
Twice a month. When do these ideas come to you? I'm just curious to get inside your head when you're creating, what that process is like, and how the last 6 weeks have impacted your creativity.
Well, I'm fortunate to have a diverse range of friends. So when the pandemic hit, my first impulse was to go to the scientists that I knew and to see what kind of films do you want to talk about. So like I said, I spoke to an epidemiologist about contagion films. I've got a podcast coming up with a neuroscientist who talks about pandemic films, but looking at it from a neuroscientist point of view, to see, to look at things like anxiety and stress, and also some interesting things about how fear is just as much a disease that we can be susceptible to as a virus itself. And so we talk about films that deal with pandemics. I'm also talking to a guy who calls himself the Doctor of the Dead, and we are going to talk about zombie films and what you can learn about dealing with a pandemic from zombie movies. But the other part of me goes to like these TCM friends I have, who we meet every year at the TCM Film Festival. We share a love of classic films. So I also have a podcast on escapist spy movies, like really wacky, silly, not realistic spy movies, but the ones that are just kind of goofball and allow you to escape through the ridiculousness of that. So, I like to see how pop culture informs us about the world around us, and what can we learn from pop culture. If you read World War Z, Max Brooks's book, you would know pretty much everything that's going on right now, because he predicted a lot of this, and he kind of predicted which countries would survive better than others and which countries would have what kind of responses. So, I feel like pop culture really offers us some insights in unexpected ways.
That's a great answer. We've got a question. I don't know if you can read it on the chat.
Oh,
from Randy. I
can put glasses on to read this.
No,
what else happened? But a few months ago, you mentioned digital gym films moved to the Ken Cinema. All right. Well, so Ken Cinema. For those of us who've been in San Diego a long time, this is a place that we treasure for movies. And right before this pandemic hit, Landmark Theaters was not renewing its lease at Landmark. The owners of the building wanted to keep it a cinema. The folks who run Digital Gym, which is Media Arts Center, were very interested in picking up the lease for the Ken Cinema. However, the people who run the Digital Gym are also the organization that puts on the Latino Film Festival, which had to cancel its festival the day it was supposed to start. So that was a $200,000 to $250,000 financial loss, which they may not be able to recoup in any way. So the fact that the Ken can't reopen right now, and the fate of, cinemas is a little up in the air right now. I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, fingers are crossed. The owners of the Ken still say they want to see it remain a cinema. Media Arts is interested. There's also another group in San Diego interested in possibly taking it over. There are definitely people who want to keep it running as a cinema. So that's the good news. It's just a question of how is all this going to impact, how long can the owners of the building go without having, money come in from a lease before they decide maybe they should just sell it. Everybody wants to see it continue. So let's keep our fingers crossed that things will work out. But I don't have any concrete specific information. Sorry.
I think Joyce Axelrod had a question. Joyce, we can unmute you if you still do have the question. Give it a shot.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I know the Latino Film Festival had to abort, and that was very sad. Are there any film festivals that are doing some really creative things that we might be able to copy for our San Diego Jewish Film Festival?
I think most of the festivals are all kind of doing similar things, which is to create these kind of virtual screenings where people can buy a ticket to see a particular film with part of those profits going back to the festival, and then augmenting that with a follow-up Q&A or a discussion with the filmmaker or some sort of a panel. I haven't seen anything like wildly innovative, like just off the charts kind of different. A lot of the big festivals too, like I think Toronto and a couple of others, are really exploring what kind of online options they might have. But right now, most of it is revolving around streaming a film and then creating some sort of a Zoom or Netflix watch party or Facebook event where people can partake in a Q&A. There are some festivals like the 48-Hour Film Festival, which is encouraging people to make films that are employing whatever limitations we have sheltering at home. And I've seen a couple of those films, and there are some that are, really clever and creative in terms of showing that. But I can't say there's something that's like wildly different from that at this point in time, but Neon Films has come up with, they're not a festival, but they are trying to do what they're calling pop-up screenings and drive-in movie theater screenings. So there's a possibility that drive-in theaters could come back. We have a couple in San Diego, and the South Bay Drive-In was operating up until I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. And they were enforcing a social distancing of cars as well. So you had to be 10 feet apart, even if you were in your car. I believe their bathrooms and snack bar were closed, but you could come in and watch a double feature if you wanted. So, maybe drive-ins is a place where a festival could try something new and innovative. Or I think the city forced them to close down, but Neon said that they have lined up some drive-in theaters across the country for some potential screenings. So maybe
could you ever conceptualize taking a giant parking lot and having people watch films with a giant screen and remote audio? Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, it definitely could. It would be interesting to see. I mean, like I said, we do have a couple of actual drive-in theaters where you can do it. I mean, and the way drive-ins now do audio is through your car stereo.
Yes.
So it's a frequency, so you feed the audio through that. So I'm sure there's ways that these things could be pulled off. It could be a, renaissance for the drive-in.
Yeah, if there's a will, I think there would be a way, right?
Yeah,
Good.
Joyce,
Thank you.
sure.
thank you, Joyce. We actually had a conversation a couple of days ago with Betsy Lynch and Chris Fink, who's the chair of the Film Selection Committee, kicking around the idea of a drive-in, and maybe even like in a pop-up way where we find the right lot and the right setting and do it. There are obvious limitations and concerns, but I think in terms of the community that we like to create through the film festivals, and especially looking ahead to next year where things might still not be back to normal, but be better than they are now. Any opportunity to leave the home and not stream it sounds like a good idea. And I know Sandra is raising her hand. I think she wants to volunteer with me. If we do the drive-in, Sandra and I are going to both put on roller skates, and we'll deliver drinks and popcorn right to the car doors, to the windows.
I think in Italy they were like projecting film on the sides of apartment buildings or something. And
That was just one place in Rome.
okay, but still,
No,
it
look,
was lovely.
Beth, the digital gym has movies that you can buy a $10 ticket for and see it at home. And I don't see what's wrong with that. People can have little parties and watch the Jewish films. God willing, and the creeks don't rise, that it's February and maybe we won't have that. But for example, our selection committee is meeting on Zoom. I guess we're about to switch to Google Hangout or something. Well, I got to tell you, I always love your Film Geeks programs and admire your insight into films.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Digital Gym is, running films, 3 films every week that you can buy, the virtual tickets to. And, it's helping them bring some income in. And there's, a lot of films, it's perfectly fine to stream movies. There's a lot on there. I do we call them Zoom in theater, where, we pick a film and we either watch it on whatever service it's on, or we share a screen, and then there's 10 or 12 of us that watch together. I mean, we watched the god awful Cats that way because nobody wanted to really watch it on their own, but we thought as a group experience it might be fun. So we just had constant running commentary through that because we were all aghast at how absolutely horrible it was. But there are ways to still share a film even when we're sheltering at home.
Fun little conversation there. A really good question. I'm interested in hearing your response to this, Beth, from Joseph Folletti. Joseph asks, if you dial down the screwball component, which diminishes the characters a bit, is there perhaps a parallel these days to the evolution of Disney princesses?
Oh, personally, I would have to say absolutely not, just because I have a horrible aversion to Disney princesses. I'm sorry if I've offended anybody with that, but the Disney princesses are much more like Doris Day to me. Like they're very like they're so obvious in the message they are trying to convey. And to me, one of the things I love about the Screwball comedies is they weren't message films. They were just wacky characters in these situations, and you could pull things out of those stories. But to me, a lot of what I find frustrating in like with the Disney princesses is they all have these agendas that they're trying to promote. And so I would have a hard time making that analogy, and I will totally upfront confess a personal prejudice on this point. So do not take any offense at that, but it would bias me in this respect.
There we go. I think we can leave it there with the Disney princesses. Beth, thank you very much for your time tonight. It was great having this conversation and having you join us. Certainly a treat for all of us to listen to you and interact and ask some questions. So thank you very much. Where can everybody find you, hear you, read you, see you?
Sure. So if you want to hear any of the podcasts, and I highly recommend you listen to the Screwball Comedy podcast, because I had the Nitrate Diva on, Nora Fiore, and there's a lot of clips in it. So you can get a real flavor for which of those Screwball comedies you might want to check out. But you can find my podcast at kpbs.org/cinemajunkie. And you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Cinebeth. And I also have a Facebook page for Cinema Junkie as well. And I'm pretty active on social media. So if you shout out a question to me or want a recommendation for a film or trying to track a movie down or just, want to talk about film, I'm fairly accessible on all of those platforms.
That's great. And we'll send out an email in the coming days that provides those links and also some of Beth's recommendations. Perhaps we could even link Beth up through our Facebook page for the film festival. It'd be a good little way for some one-stop shopping. And film fans, while you're here next Tuesday at 7:30, we've got an interesting one. A couple executives from MOPA are joining us to discuss the impact of science fiction films on who they are, their personalities and passions. And it will be fun to say the least. I feel like I'm in a bit over my head in that sci-fi world, but we're gonna see what we come up with and enjoy the ride. I think another good way to be intellectually stimulated without having to think too hard, yet also entertained and a good diversion. So stay tuned for that one. Beth, thank you again very much. This was a wonderful evening. Thank you everybody for joining us. Stay strong and healthy, and we'll see you soon.